As you might already know, I love nature. Love being out in nature, out in the wilderness. I love sunsets. I love hiking, rock, like bouldering, climbing mountains. There's just something about experiencing God's creation and allowing yourself to be challenged by it, pushing yourself, therefore recognizing all the better your creation, right? How God created you, who you are as God's creation compared to the gazillion other of God's creations. Your interaction with what God has created, not what man has created, although there's a lot of cool things that we've been able to do. And technically speaking, it's not creation, it's things that we fabricate. God creates amazing things out of nothing. And so to interact with that is pretty great. And then, of course, who here enjoys a good Nebraska thunderstorm? And that the crazier it seems to be, the more faces are by the windows watching it. So there's another kind of encounter with God's creation when we get to see how powerful it is. And of course, being in Nebraska, while we've had opportunities to see how powerful God's creation is, and yet it still isn't the most powerful. We've seen streamlined winds that can do incredible damage to our fabrications. And yet, so more have seen that. A few have seen tornadoes, not streamlined winds, but twisting winds that can seem to do even more damage, but yet less damage, right? So more damage to what it precisely hits, but it has a more precise path that it's taking. What's the word I want? Not precise. I want to say streamlined, but that's just weird, going against streamlined winds, which can be bigger. Has a more distinct path, I guess, more pinpointed. And yet, even that's still not the greatest of disasters that can be experienced by humans on Earth. Because there's the tornadoes that are out in the water, right? So there's the cyclones, I'm drawing a blank, but anyways, say it louder. Is it cyclones? Okay, so there's that. Hurricanes, that's what I was thinking of, right? So the hurricanes, right. So tsunamis, that's another great one. But what you would get to see, right, so because not only is that just the strong winds, but now there's the element of water in much greater force than just raining down. Because it's coming. All right, so then there's earthquakes, and there's exploding volcanoes, and there's snowstorms, just all sorts of amazing, powerful things that this planet can do and that we can experience and survive through, and sometimes not survive through. It's so powerful it can take life. It's pretty powerful. And in our readings today, both our first reading and in our gospel, Job gets to hear God's answer to his struggles, and Jesus gives, since he is God, gives God's answer to the struggles of his disciples in the midst of God's creation. And so he starts with God talking to Job just exclaiming, look, I know you're going through difficulties, but I was the one who is able to take that great power of nature, and I'm the one who gives it limits. God is the one that tells the elements what their limits and their borders are. So even as powerful as nature is, it's not all powerful. The ocean, as vast and as deep as it is, it only comes so far up to the beaches. And then even when there are the hurricanes or the tsunamis, even that tidal wave only comes so high. There's always limits. And God is the one who pronounced those limits. That means he's more powerful than these powerful forces that we've seen in nature. Now, you might just hear that and go, well, yeah, because he's God. That makes sense. But then do you believe that? Will you allow yourself to encounter his power in the midst of going through so much great natural power and disturbing natural power, whether it is during the storms, the storms of nature, or the storms of life? Do we turn to God in prayer and say, Lord, I trust you. I know you are all powerful and you give limits to humanity and nature. Lord, in my humbleness, I know I cannot stop the tornado. I know you can. So I turn to you. Let your will be done. Will you let this tornado come and injure your servant, as terrible of a servant as I am? And we just put it up to him. I'm not telling him what to do, but I'm expressing to him my desire and my humble acknowledgement of who he is. I'm turning to him instead of me trying to control everything. Now, I'm going to certainly batten down the hatches, right? I'm going to put down the natural safety precautions as much as possible. But perhaps in the midst of that, can I be praying? Hence the beauty of chaplets, whether it's the rosary, the Divine Mercy chaplet, something with repetition, so that I can allow those prayers to be the background music to the scurriness while I'm preparing, I'm going into safety as best we can, while at the same time trusting in God and calling on him for his supernatural help, because his power is greater than that power of nature that is very powerful and scary at times. I do not remember how young I was, but I'm pretty sure all of my siblings had been born by that time. I could be wrong, but I remember there being a threat of a tornado. And so my mom ushers all of us kids down to the basement. Well, my stepdad was probably outside looking for the tornado, I'm guessing. I don't know. I was a kid. I didn't know. And she started leading us in the rosary. And that memory taught me so much. She didn't have to say, this is what we do. She just did it. And I could tell, this is what we do. In the midst of things that we can't control, we turn to God and say, Lord, I know you can control it. And so I give this over to you. What happens, happens. It's in your hands. And we did not get run over by a tornado. I don't even know if a tornado actually landed. I was too young. I don't remember all the details. Just remember the the intensity of the moment, the somewhat fear, but we weren't fearful because we turned to God. Notice how in the gospel, when his disciples turned to Jesus, they turned not, yes, they turned for his help, but they did so in a way that was a little confusing. Because Jesus gets up, shows his power over the elements, and then turns to his disciples and says, "Why are you terrified?" It's as if you did not trust me. You did not trust my power over my creation. And so it's just a really good question to ask ourselves. Why are we terrified? Now, fear at a certain level is given to us by God. There's a natural part. Fear is a motivator. It elicits that fight, flight, or freeze elements that we have within us. What should we do? So there's something natural and good about that. But if we let fear take over our lives, then we're no longer trusting in God's power. And what that looks like in everyone is going to be different. So just ask yourself that question. If I were in that boat with Jesus, what would I be doing? Some might just jump overboard. Some might want to just do what Jesus did. I'm just going to get underneath the stern. I'm just going to fall asleep and pretend like it ain't happening. Jesus wasn't pretending like it wasn't happening, but trying to wish it away. But at least the good thing was they were trying to get close to Jesus. Some would do exactly what the disciples were doing, perhaps just because they're just following along. Wake them up. It's good to call out on the Lord. But with what sense? With confidence? Or with this terrified call? I don't know what else to do. I'm going to call on you, but I don't really think you can do anything. I'm just mad that you're asleep. It's as if you don't love us. It doesn't sound like real faith or trust in who God really is. So just be aware of that inside yourself. How do you react to things that you're not in control of? Is that when you start to get kind of hyper emotional? And ask yourself why. When you notice the emotions getting higher, allow yourself to turn to God and say, "Okay, Lord, help me to trust in you more. I realize that I am not in control of this situation, but you are. So, whatever you will, Lord." What is it then that when we encounter Jesus, what should our response be? Because I would like to hold out to you that when we encounter the power of nature, we are experiencing part of God, not in a pantheistic sort of way, but God planned this planet to react in the way that it does. So we encounter the mind of God in some way. Not that the mind of God is destructive, but powerful. And in some of that destruction comes new life, healthier life. I just got done camping up at Ponca State Park a few weeks ago. And there they do controlled burns in the forest. And so while hiking, you can see charred ground and charred trees, but also a whole lot of rich, bright green grasses and flowers and whatever, I don't know. It was so thick with new life. It was beautiful. How do we respond when we encounter Jesus in his creation? Do we realize that we're encountering his love when we're out there in nature? When we become disciples of Jesus, when we make that decision, I believe and trust in Jesus' power, and I want to follow him and be his disciples, then we are impelled to act according to that love. That's why it's so important to take note. How am I reacting inside to even the dangerous elements that are around us? Do I allow myself to recognize God's love in it so that I can then look at our second reading? Because St. Paul tells us that the love of Christ impels us. We move forward when we can recognize God's love. How much did he love? Well, St. Paul tells us that he died for all. And so it takes us to be convinced that Jesus, who gave his all for us, is all-powerful. That he died, one man died once for all. That's billions of people over the thousands of years. Billions upon billions of people. That's pretty powerful. That's a lot of love. If he died for us, and we have become his disciples, those of us who have made that decision, then we recognize that we too have died. And this is some good news. You see, when I come to that conviction, then living for myself seems pointless. God's love is so much greater than mine. So why am I still just living for myself? How about if I live for God's love? See, it's this forgetting of self. And therefore, living like Jesus did, being at service of others, being loving towards others. When I accept Jesus and what he has done for us, his church, and how he died and rose again for our salvation, when I accept his power, not only over the world's elements, but over life and death, I can stop worrying about my own life and start living in his life. St. Paul continues, consequently, from now on, we regard no one according to the flesh. You see, a disciple doesn't look at others' weaknesses. I encounter you and I don't look at you as like, oh, you're just a bother. Oh, you're that annoying person. Oh, you're the one who tells terrible jokes. Oh, you're the priest that gives really long homilies. Don't look at each other in their weaknesses. When I do that, I'm living for myself. But when when I die to self, and I'm living in the Lord because I'm his disciple, then, as St. Paul continues, the old things have passed away. But at the potential that God has for everyone, Jesus says, behold, new things has come. And he says that through St. Paul. Instead of me looking out at his creation and seeing weakness and terrible disaster, in not in humanity, but in nature. Instead, I see potential of God's love changing your life. I see Jesus in you, wanting to bring his grace out from within you to share with the world. And if I don't see it coming out, then as a disciple, I would want to find ways to encourage you to follow Jesus, to let his grace flow through you. When I don't do that, I must be just living for myself. I encourage us all to seek the Lord in all things and in all people, to put your trust in his power and to follow that power, to die to self and to live in Christ, constantly seeking him. Lord, guide me. Let your will be done in my life and in the way I interact with others. That I not see their weaknesses, but instead I see your potential in them.